Okay, so Anne Turner is a retired physician. She has a long career in the medical world, and now she's a volunteer with the Physicians for Responsibility.
So I I worked in a community health center for almost my entire career, and I really came to working on climate issues after seeing that this seems really to be the biggest health issue that we have worldwide. So because I worked in a community health center, I also realized, kind of firsthand how much this has to do with environmental justice, and how communities who are low income and minority communities are so disproportionately impacted by climate change.
Okay. So I think the slides are working now, I believe. Okay. So if you want to jump in.
Sure. So thanks for being here. And I'll talk about the harms of gas in your home, and particularly from gas stoves, and also the benefits of electrification, which you've seen a lot in these great videos. So, and I'll do that from the standpoint of climate, air pollution, and environmental justice. So a lot of us may not have realized until recently that buildings really are a source of greenhouse gas emissions, and there are 70 million in the US that burn fossil fuels, and that accounts for about 10% of our greenhouse gas emissions. More from space and water heating, but also from cooking. And as you can see this at the bottom, there are 43, actually it should read 43 million gas stoves in the US have the same climate change effect as the amount of CO2 from 500,000 gasoline powered cars. Next slide. So as Laura has talked about, natural gas, so-called natural gas, is methane, and it is much more potent than carbon dioxide in its first 20 years, more than 80 times as potent. They call it CO2's evil twin. And as Laura also mentioned, it leaks all along its life cycle from fracking wells into our homes. And we now know that these leaks really are twice the amount that the EPA has estimated, and that, in fact, makes methane worse than coal in warming our climate. Next slide. So this year, we learned that our gas stoves and ovens also leak methane even when they're off. Eric LaBelle and others at Stanford measured methane levels in homes with both new and older gas stoves when they were on and when they were off, and found that 76% of emissions of methane occurred when they were off. And it didn't really matter whether they were new or old. Next slide. So cooking with gas pollutes our indoor air. If it's bad for the climate, it's bad for your health. We have had a love affair with our gas stoves, successfully promoted by the gas industry. But it's only recently, I think, that we've really become aware of how dangerous gas stoves and ovens are by emitting these toxic air pollutants inside of our homes: nitrogen dioxide, particulate matter, carbon monoxide, formaldehyde, and sulfur dioxide. I will talk about the first three. These are basically the same pollutants that we find in car exhaust. Next slide. So nitrogen dioxide. Well, on average, we spend more than 90% of our time indoors. The World Health Organization in Canada have indoor standards for levels of nitrogen dioxide, but in the US, we have none. And so we have found that in homes with gas stoves, NO2 levels exceed both the indoor guidelines and the outdoor standards. And in fact, they're 50 to 400% higher than those in homes that cook with electric stoves. Next slide. So these levels we not only find in the kitchen, but they quickly escape to other parts of the house. The red line you can see are the levels of nitrogen dioxide in the kitchen, and the blue line in the bedroom. The standard for both indoor and outdoor air is about 100 parts per billion, which may be actually too high. But as you can see in 3 of these 4 scenarios, NO2 levels were higher than 100 parts per billion in the bedroom as well as the kitchen. And you can see how quickly these levels rise, the upward spike, such that they rise to levels that are unsafe in less time than it takes to scramble an egg. Next slide. So nitrogen dioxide is a lung irritant that causes, exacerbates, and triggers asthma, especially in children. 2013 meta-analysis of 41 different studies concluded that children living in a home with a gas stove had a 42% increase in the risk of asthma, a 24% increase in the risk for lifetime asthma, and a 32% increased risk of current asthma. And not only that, these levels start at low levels. In another study, children ages 5 to 10 exposed to NO2 levels indoors found worsening of symptoms at levels as low as 6 parts per billion, and continued worsening of those symptoms as these levels rise for every 5 parts per billion increase. Next slide. So particulate matters, so-called PM 2.5. So these these tiny particles have been called a silent killer and are responsible for more than 9 million deaths each year worldwide from air pollution. That's almost 20% of all deaths. On the far left, you can see this structure, this graphic that looks kind of like the Leaning Tower of Pisa, and that represents the human hair. And the small blue dot just to the right of it is the size of PM 2.5. So we breathe these tiny particles deep into our lungs, into our tiny air sacs, where they enter our bloodstream, causing damage to our vital organs, hearts, blood vessels, lungs, brains, and our reproductive system. So acutely, exposure to PM 2.5 increases blood pressure and the risk of stroke, and chronic exposure increases the risk of premature mortality, asthma, premature birth, and low birth weight babies. Next slide. Well, you may wonder, doesn't cooking itself produce PM 2.5? Well, that's true, yes, at high temperatures especially. But gas stoves produce twice as much, and electric stoves don't release NO2, carbon monoxide, or other air pollutants. Excuse me. Next slide. Carbon monoxide. There are no safe levels, and carbon monoxide displaces oxygen so that the tissues that are affected first are the heart and brain. And certainly the elderly, children, and the fetus, and those with underlying health conditions, like this woman experiencing either angina or a heart attack, are the most sensitive to the effects of carbon monoxide. Every year, people die from carbon monoxide poisoning that's not related to car exhaust. And many of those are from trying to use gas to heat their homes. Next slide. Well, in terms of environmental justice, we know that across the country, people of color and communities with lower incomes are disproportionately exposed to outdoor air pollution, so that indoor air pollution from burning gas in our home is a double burden. Lower income and people of color are more likely to live in smaller homes, so the concentration of pollutants is higher. And in multi-generational homes with more people, stoves and ovens are used more, increasing levels of pollutants also. They may not have adequate ventilation. And certainly if you're using your stove or oven for supplemental heat, that is going to definitely increase your levels of pollution. Also, people of color and people of low income are more likely to live in areas where they're exposed to higher levels of outdoor pollution, often adjacent to highways or industrial facilities. And these populations often have a higher incidence of underlying conditions like asthma. Next slide. So what can you do to decrease your risk, of your family's risk, if you do have a gas stove? So we've already heard some of these from this great presentations of folks in homes, and both of them had induction stoves, but you can also cook with electric appliances that you may already own, like an electric tea kettle, a toaster oven, an Instapot, or your microwave. And you can get a single burner induction plug-in for less than $100. Well, when you're ready to replace your gas stove, definitely try to go electric. In the meantime, you should try to install a carbon monoxide monitor. Always run the fan, but to be effective, use it on its highest speed, because most hoods or exhaust hoods work best if you cook on the back burners. A survey in California found that less than half of the people with gas stoves use their fans at all. Also, open a window unless, next slide, there are high levels of air pollution from wildfires, and then don't open the windows. And in fact, you really shouldn't be using your gas ovens and stoves. So the bottom line is, next slide, that electric kitchens are healthier. These are three studies that have been done to demonstrate that. There's indirect evidence from a longitudinal study done in California over 20 years, showing that when pollution controls were required for cars, NO2 levels decreased and childhood asthma levels decreased, and those tracked in tandem, so that the lower as the NO2 levels dropped, so did asthma levels. Secondly, a study done in Boston in which residents of public housing were moved to all electric apartments, it showed that there were significant decreases in multiple indoor air pollutant levels and improved outcomes of health issues, health indicators among residents. And lastly, a study in Baltimore randomized 78 homes with gas stoves to receive one of three interventions to decrease their NO2 levels. And they measured those continuously over a week: a hood, a carbon filter system, or an electric stove. So replacing the gas stove with an electric one was the most effective intervention, and providing a hood was the least effective. So, next slide. In summary, burning anything indoors is not healthy. We need to electrify everything. An individual action certainly helps, but it's not enough. So talking to your friends and working for policies that make electrification the way of the future and possible for everyone is the way to go. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Anne. So we have a little time for questions. That was very informative. Thank you. If people want to ask Anne, and then also, again, if we don't have time to get to them all, they can move into the chat afterwards.
We do have a few questions. One of them from Linda. When speaking about gas stoves, do you include propane in that as well?
Well, I certainly think that it makes sense to include propane. It hasn't been studied nearly as well, but it is definitely one of the things that needs to be studied. And since it is a fossil fuel and does burn to the same, it causes the same kind of air pollution, it makes sense to think that the propane is equal to methane gas.
Awesome, thank you. And then a question from Carolyn about what else in the home besides stoves can produce these dangers.
Well, if you have a gas fireplace insert, that's doing the same thing inside your home. There's some question of whether or not your gas furnace or water heater or electric dryer may kind of put gas back into your home, even though it's vented to the outside. If you have a gas water heater, even an on-demand, particularly an on-demand gas water heater, every time you turn on, at any moment you just slightly turn on your hot water, it releases a puff of methane. So methane itself doesn't produce a health risk inside your home, but it's creating more methane.
Awesome, thank you. And then I think maybe one last question about wood burning stoves also being considered.
Yes, well, wood is and essentially another fossil fuel, and it basically produces the same. Well, actually, I'm not sure so much about the nitrogen dioxide, but it certainly produces particulate matter. I would have to look into that for sure, but it's definitely produces indoor pollutants.
Alrighty, awesome. Well, there might be a couple that we can come back to later, but I think Laura, if we want to move on,
Okay,
we can
great.
do
Yeah.
that now.
Thank you, Anne, for joining us. I really appreciate